No one in the studio thought the night would spiral the way it did. The set gleamed under the studio lights, every angle crafted for television perfection. Makeup touched up, microphones clipped, water glasses placed just so. The questions had been rehearsed down to the syllable, the topics lined up like dominoes meant to fall in a safe, orderly way. The night was supposed to be nothing more than another polite clash of talking points, a bit of heat, a few smirks for the cameras, then everyone shaking hands off air like actors leaving a stage. It was predictable, comfortable, contained. But Jasmine Crockett was not built for containment. She didn't just come to play along. She came to fracture the script. You could see it in the way her eyes scanned the table, not restless, but calculating, like she knew exactly where the first crack in the dam would be. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't a jab or a casual disagreement. It was a lit match in a room full of dry paper. She didn't just challenge the narrative. She blew a hole straight through it. And in that moment, every person in the room felt the ground shift beneath them. The cameras were rolling, the red light glowing like an unblinking eye, when Jasmine leaned forward just enough for the tension to register. Her hands didn't move. Her shoulders didn't shift. Only her gaze locked, unwavering, pinning the panel, like a prosecutor sizing up a jury. And then she said it, slow and deliberate. If we're going to talk about corruption, then we need to talk about the people who bankroll it. It didn't land like a question. It landed like a verdict. The sound engineer later swore he could hear the air leave the room through his headset. The host froze mid-breath, his practiced smile stiffening into something closer to panic. The other guests sat back slightly, the kind of instinctive retreat you make when someone drops something dangerous in the middle of the table. Even in living rooms across the country, viewers felt it a ripple through the screen. The unspoken knowledge that whatever was about to happen wasn't scripted. It wasn't spin. It was a breach. And no one, not the host, not the guests, not the audience, was ready for what came next. She reached for a folder thin enough to look harmless, unmarked enough to pass as nothing, yet somehow carrying a weight that shifted the entire room. The sound of it sliding across the polished table was soft, almost polite, but it carried the finality of a gavel. She opened it with no theatrics, no flourish, just the quiet certainty of someone holding something that could not be ignored. The first page was turned, and in bold, undeniable print sat a name that seemed to pull every molecule of oxygen out of the air. Sean Diddy Combs. For a moment, no one moved. It wasn't a headline or a half-whispered rumor meant to stir gossip. It was hard ink on paper. No vague accusations, no speculative language, just a clean, brutal line between a music empire and political machinery that reached directly into Donald Trump's inner circle. The proof wasn't hidden in footnotes. It stared back in black and white transaction records with exact figures, charity filings with dates that matched campaign events, offshore account details that connected dots no one had dared connect on live television. The camera zoomed in just enough to catch the stillness on her face, the kind you only see when someone knows the truth is about to walk into the room and take its seat. The moderator blinked, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and the dawning realization that this was no ordinary exchange. His lips parted, and he tried to wedge in the kind of cautious, damage-controlling question hosts are trained to ask. Are you alleging?" he began, his tone reaching for neutrality but already fraying at the edges. Jasmine didn't let him finish. Her eyes stayed locked, her posture unshaken, and she cut in with the kind of precision that leaves no space to recover. "I'm not alleging anything. I'm reading it to you." The words didn't rise in volume, but they landed like a hammer striking glass. Her voice carried no tremor, no hesitation, but there was a density to it, the kind of weight that makes a person instinctively lean back, as if the very air in front of them has grown heavier. Around the table, subtle movements betrayed the panelists' nerves, a shifting in seats, fingers tapping once before retreating, eyes darting toward the folder as though it might detonate. Even the camera crew felt it, the kind of charged silence that pulls the whole room inward, making every breath feel too loud. In that instant, it was no longer a discussion. It was a reckoning, and everyone knew it. She turned a page, and the faint rustle of paper might as well have been a gunshot in the silence. What stared back from that sheet wasn't gossip or spin. It was the dry, bureaucratic language of hard evidence. Bank records with exact figures down to the cent. Wire transfers stamped with dates that lined up perfectly with high-profile political events everyone remembered but had never thought to question. There was a PAC donation in bold print, one that had sat unnoticed in public filings for months, maybe years until now, when Jasmine slid it into the light where no one could pretend not to see it. She didn't look at the panelists as she spoke. She looked straight into the lens, as if addressing every living room, every phone screen, every pair of eyes watching. "This isn't about music. she said, her tone sharpened but calm. This is about power. About how entertainment money doesn't just buy influence, it launders it, cleans it, repackages it until it looks respectable enough to shake hands in Washington. Her fingers tapped once on the page, a small, deliberate gesture that drew every gaze back to the ink. And if we're going to pretend that doesn't happen, she continued, her voice now edged with something colder, then we might as well admit this whole system is for sale, and every single one of you already knows the price. The shock wasn't loud, it was suffocating. The kind of silence that presses against your skin and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. A moment earlier, the studio had been alive, with the predictable back and forth of political theater, voices overlapping, interruptions disguised as wit, laughter that never reached anyone's eyes. Now, all of it was gone. The air felt denser, heavier, as though the words she had just spoken had weight you could physically feel. No one dared shuffle papers. No one reached for their water glass. Even the producers, normally quick to cue a commercial the second a conversation drifted into dangerous territory, stayed frozen behind the glass. The countdown clocks, the flashing signals, the silent hand gestures, all of it stopped. The panelists stared, caught between disbelief and the dawning horror of recognizing that what was in that folder could not be spun away. Jasmine didn't glance toward the cameras, didn't adjust her posture for the perfect frame. She wasn't here to perform. Her stillness was its own force, and her refusal to fill the silence only made it roar louder in the minds of everyone watching. The truth didn't need her to shout. It had already taken the room hostage. Trump's allies on the panel began to shift, their polished confidence unraveling in real time. The smug half-smiles they'd worn at the start of the segment were gone, replaced by tight jaws and restless glances toward the host, as if silently begging for an intervention that wasn't coming. Their rehearsed talking points lines, designed to deflect, distract, and dominate the conversation, crumbled under the sheer weight of numbers and dates inked on those pages. One man, clearly trying to salvage the moment, leaned forward and cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a pebble dropped into deep water. He never got the chance to speak. Jasmine, without raising her voice or breaking her gaze, slid another page across the table, the paper gliding forward like a final push toward the edge. This one was heavier than the rest, not in weight, but in consequence. A wire transfer, clean and undeniable, from a Diddy-affiliated company to a PAC directly tied to one of Donald Trump's most loyal backers. No interpretation needed. No context to hide behind. Just the kind of ink on paper that ruins careers. She tapped it once, the sound crisp against the table's surface. That, she said, her voice low and steady, isn't opinion. That's evidence. And in that instant, even those inclined to defend him knew there was no clever way to talk their way out of what was staring back at them. Somewhere inside Trump's camp, the first phone started ringing, and then another, and then a chain of calls that didn't stop for hours. Assistants darted between offices, eyes wide, clutching printouts, and whispering in hallways where even walls suddenly felt like they could listen. This wasn't the kind of bad press they were used to, the kind you could bury under a fiery tweet, an insult hurled at the right target, or a quick segment on a friendly network. No, this was different. This was a rupture. A breach that didn't just scratch the surface of their narrative, it cut straight through the foundation. Every name, every date, every dollar on those pages was a direct hit on a shadow network they'd spent years insisting didn't exist. A network built not in press releases but in backroom agreements, sealed with handshakes no one was supposed to see. And now, somehow, Jasmine Crockett had those handshakes on paper, staring back under studio lights. In campaign war rooms and private offices, the air turned frantic. The quiet confidence of untouchability was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of panic. They weren't thinking about the next news cycle anymore. They were thinking about survival. Sources later painted a vivid picture of the moment Trump saw the clip, a moment that, for those in the room, felt less like watching television and more like standing too close to a live wire. He was on his feet before the segment even ended, pacing the length of the room in sharp, agitated strides, one hand slicing the air as if trying to physically cut down the words playing from the screen. Shouts erupted, not just the booming voice he used at rallies, but the raw, unfiltered kind that rattled furniture. "Who let this get out?" he barked, the question more of an accusation than a search for answers. Eyes darted between advisors, each one desperate not to be the next target. Papers were grabbed, waved, tossed aside. Phones buzzed with incoming calls from allies already panicking about the fallout. His inner circle moved quickly to corral him, urging restraint. telling him to stay quiet, to let the noise fade without feeding it. "Don't give the story oxygen," one of them repeated like a mantra. But outside that room, it was already too late. The story wasn't gasping for breath, it was roaring. Hashtags were trending, news alerts were pinging, and video clips were multiplying like sparks in dry grass. This wasn't a rumor that could be starved. This was a blaze, and it was already spreading faster than anyone in his camp could run. Meanwhile, in Diddy's world, there was no calm, only a tightening storm. People in his inner circle, once quick to post flashy updates and curated snapshots of their lives, suddenly went silent on social media. Accounts that had been loud just hours earlier went dark, their timelines freezing like a clock stopped mid-tick. Behind the scenes, the corridors of power in his empire hummed with an anxious energy. Lawyers were making late-night calls, their voices low, clipped, and urgent, speaking in code as if the wrong word might make the walls lean in closer. PR teams huddled over laptops, drafting statements that were torn apart minutes later, rewritten, then scrapped entirely when someone realized that no clever wording could erase what was now public record. The usual playbook, deny, distract, discredit, was suddenly useless. How do you spin numbers and signatures? How do you bury a timeline that matches perfectly with events people watched unfold on live television? The documents weren't whispered rumors hidden in some obscure archive. They were out in the open, screenshots flooding feeds, PDF links bouncing from phone to phone. Every second that passed without a response was another second the narrative tightened around him. In rooms where confidence had once been currency, the only thing in surplus now was fear. Back on set, the moderator's voice wavered as he tried to steer the discussion away from the jagged edge it had landed on. He reached for neutral ground, fumbling for a question about moving forward or staying focused on the issues. But it was too late. Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to hand the conversation back to safety. She sat forward, her elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the man across from her, like she was measuring whether he actually believed the words he'd been sent there to say. When she spoke, her tone wasn't raised, but it was sharp enough to slice through the false calm the moderator was trying to stitch together. "You don't get to talk about law and order," she said, every syllable deliberate, while ignoring the people funding your campaigns through back channels. The words landed heavy, not just because of what they meant, but because of how she said them with the absolute certainty of someone who had the receipts to back them up. The panelists shifted again, their bodies betraying what their mouths couldn't yet admit. The host hesitated, glanced toward the control room for a cue that didn't come. It wasn't just that Jasmine had broken the flow of the show. It was that she'd ripped away the curtain, forcing everyone at that table and everyone watching at home to see the machinery of influence for what it really was. And still, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't lunge across the table or jab a finger in anyone's face. There was no dramatic flourish, no grandstanding for the cameras. Instead, Jasmine let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of her words and the papers in front of her to settle into the minds of everyone within earshot. Her hands stayed still, fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the folder, like she was guarding something precious and dangerous at the same time. The stillness wasn't weakness, it was power. The kind of control that makes people nervous because it means you aren't running on emotion, you're running on certainty. Every line she delivered was like a slow, deliberate push of that blade closer to the center of the table, and everyone knew it could cut deep not because she swung it wildly, but because she didn't have to. Her composure made the danger sharper. You could see it in the shifting eyes of the panelists, in the way the moderator's voice faltered, in the way even the cameras seemed to tighten their focus, as if they, too, sensed the blood in the water. It wasn't just what she had. It was how she held it. Calm, unshaken, deadly. By the next morning, the internet wasn't just buzzing, it was in full eruption. The clip had already been clipped, reshared, remixed, and subtitled in half a dozen languages. Hashtags like Diddy Files and Trump Ties didn't just trend in the US. They were lighting up timelines from London to Lagos, from Sydney to Sao Paulo. TikTok became a war room of armchair investigators, creators, pausing the video mid-frame, circling details with red arrows, and dropping theories that spread faster than they could film them. On Reddit, the threads were sprawling, turning into digital detective boards where usernames you'd never seen before suddenly posted exhaustive breakdowns of corporate structures, shell companies, and offshore entities. Some were pieced together with public filings, others from obscure PDFs that had clearly been dug out of deep archives. Twitter spaces were packed with thousands, debating whether this was the beginning of a political reckoning or just the first volley in a longer, uglier fight. Even on platforms that usually ignored politics, The story bled through fashion blogs, music forums, celebrity gossip accounts, all suddenly posting the same grainy still of Jasmine Crockett sliding those papers across the table. The story wasn't just viral. It had gone feral, mutating and multiplying, feeding on every share, every theory, every new scrap of information. And for the first time, it felt like the narrative wasn't being shaped by politicians or pundits. It was being built, brick by brick, by the people watching. The most damning part wasn't the shock of the reveal or even the viral wildfire that followed it, was the silence, where a direct denial should have been. In the hours and days after Jasmine's folder hit the table, neither Trump nor Diddy stood in front of a microphone to say the words that could have stopped the bleeding. This is false. Those words never came. Instead, the public got carefully packaged statements from nameless aides and faceless PR teams, speaking in the safe, slippery language that lives in the gray area between guilt and innocence. Phrases like political distractions and irrelevant smears floated into the news cycle vague enough to dodge the specifics, hollow enough to avoid the risk of a lie that could be disproven. It was the kind of messaging people use when the truth is too sharp, too detailed, too well documented to fight head-on. And that absence, that refusal to confront the accusations directly became its own kind of evidence. People started to ask the question no spin doctor wants in circulation. If it's not true, why not just say so? The silence didn't just leave room for suspicion. It filled the air with it, thick and unshakable, until even those who wanted to believe the denials realized there weren't any. For Jasmine, it was never about chasing the spotlight or milking the moment for personal gain. She didn't race to every cable news studio, sitting under hot lights to tell the same story over and over. She didn't flood her social media with victory laps or triumphant one-liners meant to rack up retweets. Instead, she did something that confused her critics and unsettled her opponents even more. She vanished. For 2 full days, no interviews, no statements, no cryptic posts, just absence. And that absence wasn't weakness, it was calculated. Because silence, in this case, wasn't retreat, it was a dare. A dare for the country to sit with the folder, the dates, the transfers, the signatures, to let the evidence breathe without distraction, without noise, without the circus that usually swallows scandals whole. In that void, the public had to wrestle with it themselves. They had to ask their own questions. They had to imagine their own answers. And for Trump's allies, for Diddy's defenders, that was the worst part, because when people start connecting the dots without being told what to think, the picture they draw is often far more damning than anything you could have scripted. When she finally reappeared, she didn't step onto the glossy set of a primetime show or into the echo chamber of a partisan network. She came back on her own terms, on her own platform, framed not by studio lights, but by the soft, even glow of a simple home setup. No makeup meant to soften the blow, no stylist to engineer a statement look, just a plain navy blouse, the kind you'd wear when you wanted people to listen to your words and not your wardrobe. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, the kind that makes you lean in because you know the weight is coming. If you're angry, she began, steady and unshaken, then be angry at the system that let this happen, not at the person who showed you the receipts. The way she said system made it sound less like an institution and more like a living thing, a machine that chews up accountability and spits out excuses. And in that moment, it was clear she wasn't positioning herself as the hero of the story. She wasn't begging for applause or sympathy. She was throwing the truth back into the laps of the people watching, telling them without saying it outright, "You saw it. Now decide what you're going to do with it." It was less a speech and more a challenge, and it landed harder than any headline could. And just like that, the entire conversation swerved off its usual tracks. What had started as a clip people thought they could file under celebrity drama or political squabble was suddenly something heavier, something that didn't fit neatly into gossip columns or partisan talking points. This wasn't about who wore what, or which side of the aisle was winning the news cycle. It was about the machinery behind the curtain, the quiet, deliberate way power buys silence, covers tracks, and turns accountability into a privilege only the powerless are forced to face. The receipts Jasmine laid out weren't just papers. They were an X-ray of the system itself, exposing the bones of deals that had always been whispered about but never proven in the light. And what made it hit harder was the fact that she hadn't sold her silence. She hadn't taken the calls, the offers, the backroom promises to make this go away. She had stood there, folder in hand, and chosen the opposite. In that choice, she'd ripped away the comfortable distance that lets the public pretend this kind of corruption only happens somewhere far away to people they'll never meet. Now, it was right in front of them, raw, unfiltered, undeniable, and whether they liked it or not, everyone watching had to face the same question. If someone can't be bought, What else might they be willing to expose?